I have seen in Bart Ehrman's book in particular, called Jesus Interrupted, 4 big points that he wants to use to discredit, in particular, Easter, in particular, of course, the resurrection of Christ. Does he have an agenda or what? Hey, welcome to Church for Skeptics. Dan Arsenal here. We're going to talk about Bart Ehrman on Easter. I know it's after Easter, but going back a little bit, and we're still kind of clinging to the resurrection of Christ, of course. I have seen in Bart Ehrman's episodes and his debates, and from his book in particular, called Jesus Interrupted, 4 big points that he wants to use to discredit, in particular, Easter, in particular, of course, the resurrection of Christ. And he says that the resurrection is not historically reliable. And there are some reasons for that. I'm going to give you 4. I'll just let you know what those are. Actually, we'll narrow them down to 3. I'll give you the 3 reasons. We'll combine 1 and 2. And then we'll take each episode and talk about one of those things. So this is going to be this one and the next one and the next one on Bart Ehrman and Easter. So here's his first point. If you want to look at some debates on YouTube, of course, look to Peter Williams, the British New Testament scholar. Look to his debate with Michael Licona, a New Testament scholar, as well, debating them, and of course his book, Jesus Interrupted. So first one is this: the gospel accounts cannot be historical, on his view, because they are not eyewitnesses. They're not eyewitness testimony. And the reason we know they're not, on his view, eyewitness testimony is because they are written too late for the eyewitnesses to have been involved. And his second point of that, it would be this: they're written in the Greek language, and none of the disciples, none of the apostles could speak Greek, or at least they couldn't write Greek. Now, how does he know that? Well, this is a case of maybes. If you listen to Bart Ehrman, it's all out about maybes, but his maybes lean against historicity, relying the resurrection of Christ. The second point that he has is, it kind of comes from the first one, is since the Gospels are late dated, they're written late, then they are the accumulation of evolving stories. Obviously, he knows that Jesus lived and died what he did in the early 30s of AD. But then those disciples were telling stories, and those stories got passed along. So we have stories from stories from stories from stories, and those stories would have evolved. And because they've evolved, they become hopelessly, in his view, hopelessly contradictory. So the New Testament documents cannot be historical because they have so many contradictions, in his view. And we'll talk about that in the next episode. Number 3, which is an interesting one, it's not factual or really even historical, but it is philosophical. And I like that in a sense because my favorite class that I ever took in undergraduate school was the philosophy of history. You can have the philosophy of history, the philosophy of science, and I think it's wonderful to do that. It's great to do that because philosophy is the love of wisdom and the logic behind history, the logic behind science, and so forth. And so on his view, history depends on the most probable telling, the most probable belief that we have about the events that we're talking about history. Miracles are the least probable, and if Jesus is resurrected from the dead, that's a miracle, and miracles are the least probable occurrence. And on that view alone, he says, which he spends a lot of time with in his debates, the resurrection of Jesus cannot be historical because it's unusual. Okay, let's look at number 1, the dating the Gospels late. And when I say late, we're talking about the consensus view. And of course, he uses that too as well. The consensus view is that the earliest gospel, maybe Mark was, most people think Mark was first, was in the late 60s, 65, and then, of course, John 90 AD or 100 AD. So you're talking about 40 to 60 years after the events that they record. And so because that's so late, there's no historical reliability. It's strange to me, and I'm going to read you some scripture here. I usually do. It's strange to me that the New Testament goes to great lengths, and the writers, whoever wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the epistles as well, went to great lengths to say that they were writing from eyewitness testimony. Let me give you just a synopsis here of some of these. 2 Peter, and by the way, the Gospel of Mark, most of the early church said was written, Mark was Peter's secretary, so the Gospel of Mark is really Peter's gospel. Peter says in one of his second letter, 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, just listen to this. He goes to great lengths to talk about his eyewitness relationship with Christ and then writing it down. He says this in verse 16 of chapter 1. For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, and the voice was borne to him from the majestic glory, this is, of course, the transfiguration, Matthew 17, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. We ourselves heard this very voice, born from heaven, and we were with him on the holy mountain. So he's going to great lengths here to say, I was an eyewitness. I was there. I know what happened. The same with the Apostle John. Let me go to, this is John's first letter. I'll just go over one more page here. 1 John chapter 1. It's the same thing. I used to think when in 1 John chapter 1 that John was talking about the whole idea of being with Jesus the whole time that he was on earth. But I think this is about the transfiguration as well. Here's what he says. That which was from the beginning, 1 John 1:1, that which was from the beginning, which is Christ, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testify to it and proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim to also to you. The whole point of writing this, he says, we're telling you what we saw. It's just hard to think that whoever wrote this, and of course on Bart Ehrman, they're not written by the apostles here. John wasn't written by John. They're all written by Greeks who were Christians probably, but they were willing to lie through their teeth to say they were eyewitnesses when in fact they were not. That doesn't make sense to me. Look at the first, the Gospel of John, rather, and in verse 1. This is, let me find it here. I'll get right back to it. Okay, John 1. And of course, this famous verse, I'll have to read the first verse here. In the beginning was the Word. John likes the word beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Verse 14. And the Word, that is God, in the flesh, and the Word became flesh, literally tabernacled. The Word became flesh and dwelt, that's the word tabernacled, among us, and we have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, what about Luke? Now, Luke was not an apostle, which is kind of puzzling concerning why would you make up the name Luke to attribute this gospel for somebody that's not an apostle? Well, here's what Luke says about it. Here he says in chapter 1, verse 1, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning, and from the beginning in this context means from the baptism of Christ. That was the beginning of his ministry. From the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, have delivered them to us. You know, it's clear in the book of Acts, of course Luke wrote Acts too, but when Paul was arrested in Jerusalem, he was sent to Caesarea for 2 years. During that 2 years, Luke was a companion of Paul. He stayed in Jerusalem. That's where all of the apostles were at that time. That's where all the eyewitnesses were at that time. That's where most of the women that were at the resurrection were. So Paul is interviewing all of those people, and that's what he says right here. He says this again. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of things that have been accomplished in us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. So here again, he's going out of his way to say that I'm not an eyewitness, but I have the testimony of eyewitnesses, and that's the basis for his gospel. It just seems weird to me that you'd have to make up a strong argument against the eyewitness testimony of the New Testament based on maybes, and that's what they're made of. So why all the late dates? Why? Of course, you want to make the dates so late that the apostles, the ones who actually wrote the New Testament, are sort of out of the picture. Why the late dates? Here again, the consensus of those late dates, the Greek language has something to do with it, but that's not the primary problem. The primary problem is this. Jesus, in all three synoptic gospels, let me move my paper here just in case I need the notes. In all three synoptic gospels, Jesus made a prediction. I'm not going to read those to you, but if you want to look them up, you're probably not taking notes, but you can pause it and get some if you want. Matthew 24 would be the first one. Mark 13 would be one, and Luke 21. In all three of those Gospels, Jesus makes a prediction about the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, if Jesus made those predictions, and this would have been, almost about 40 years, almost 40 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, which actually happened. We know that's an historical fact. The Romans destroyed it after a rebellion. Israel, the Jews, rebelled against Rome, and they destroyed the city in 70 A.D. If Jesus made that prediction, then that's another miracle. Well, that's a miracle is a problem for the consensus. You have to understand this. Consensus of scholarship is okay. I'm not just dying well against all that. Sometimes it's nice to have a crowd. But the consensus of people is that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. The consensus of the world is that Jesus is not God in the flesh and coming again. If I'm a Christian against the flow, now there's tons of evidence. It doesn't mean there's no reasonable evidence for this. But it means if I go by the consensus of everything, no telling who I'd vote for, no telling who you'd vote for, if you just want to go by the consensus. So the consensus has a factor, but it's not a deal breaker, one or the other. And the consensus has changed over the years drastically in virtually every discipline you're thinking about. There was a time when the consensus was that the earth was flat, maybe. I'm not sure how that much of the consensus there was for that. You get the point, though. And so the whole point of the consensus view that the gospel had to be written after or close to the events so they've already happened, they've already actualized. So in other words, on the consensus view, Matthew, Mark, Luke had to have been written right around 70 or after that because Jesus couldn't have predicted that. So they're putting that prophecy in the words of Jesus. Another, of course, big lie if that's the case, by saying that Jesus did it during his lifetime. Here's the problem, surprisingly. You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Luke, of course, which we just read his account and why he wrote it and the eyewitness testimony that it entailed. But then he wrote another book, the book of Acts. If he's making up the prophecy of Jesus for the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's writing that after 70 AD, why in the world wouldn't you put the fact in coupling with the prophecy, with the prediction? But in none of the New Testament writings is the destruction of Jerusalem portrayed. It's not even mentioned. When Acts, so you have Luke first, then Acts, and at the end of Acts, Peter's still alive. Luke doesn't bother. I mean, he's glad to mention the martyrs in several of them, Stephen and James, not the brother of Christ, but the apostle James. Both of them are martyred in the book of Acts. But he doesn't mention Peter's martyrdom. He doesn't mention Paul's martyrdom. Paul's still alive. Peter's still alive. At the end of Acts, the city of Jerusalem and the temple are still intact and functioning. If you really want to say, I told you so, write it, because it's already happened, but it hasn't already happened. It's so obvious that Acts is written by Luke before the destruction, well before the destruction of Jerusalem, well before the martyrdom of Paul, which was 63. So he's writing Acts. Think about this. It just seems so sensible. He's writing Acts in the late 50s or early 60s AD. Before he wrote that, he wrote the Gospel of Luke. Now we're in the 50s. Before Luke was Matthew. And so now we're in the early 50s, and before Matthew was Mark. That's the consensus, by the way. We're not talking about late. We're talking about 10, 15 years after that. Not only that, the Apostle Paul was writing before the Gospels were written, most of them. Paul's first epistle was written in about 48 AD. That's only 15 years later. So the whole idea that you're trying to drive the apostles out as being eyewitnesses, and writers of the Gospels just doesn't work. Unless you have this preconceived idea that miracles are impossible and prophecies are impossible, and so Jesus never really predicted the fall of Jerusalem. I think that's really important there. There's something else really surprising to me. Bart Ehrman wants to talk about the fact that these are stories after stories after stories, and they're all evolving, and so there are so many contradictions. And I'm wondering, what are the contradictions? Did you know that on Bart Ehrman and on the consensus view of historical scholars and Bible scholars, there are within the New Testament certain creeds that were written and composed very, very early on in Christianity. As a matter of fact, within days, weeks, or even months, but no more than that, these are composed so that the early Christians, who were probably illiterate, could share the gospel with others. I'll give you a couple of them here. The main one's 1 Corinthians 15. Now, it's in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. He says, I taught you this when I was there. Now I'm writing this to you. He wrote it in 56. He was there in 50. We know that from archaeology. And so it had to have been composed before that. And Bart Ehrman says it was composed within the first 3 months of the resurrection. Or the death of Jesus. He wouldn't believe in the resurrection, but the first 3 months of the events that it describes. Well, what does it say? It says that Jesus died according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. It hasn't changed at all. What he's talking about as being historically unreliable are secondary details that have differences in the gospel narratives. And those differences are not contradictory. We'll talk about that going forward here. So what I want to say is this. There are no, and this is the other thing, that we'll finish with this. There are no, listen carefully, because again, here's the Ehrman logic. The New Testament's late. It's not written by any eyewitnesses, so therefore the New Testament was written anonymously. We don't know who the authors were, and so, boy, the church just made up these names. Matthew, why would they make up Matthew? He's writing to Jewish people, and he's a tax collector. You don't make names up like that. Luke, who's not even an apostle. Mark, who's not an apostle. John, of course, is. Frankly, got one in there. Did you know And so his point is that the New Testament was written anonymously. It discredits it historically. Did you know that there are no, listen carefully to what I'm saying, there are no anonymous gospels? When he points to the Gospels being anonymous, he must be pointing to the earliest manuscript evidence that we have, which are just fragments. You don't have the first page of a fragment. The very earliest one we have is called the Rylands papyrus. It's papyrus number 52, 52nd one they found, but it's the earliest they found in Egypt. And it's a credit card size. You don't have an author's name on that. It's just a credit card size, and it's from John chapter 19. But the earliest 20, I counted 27, the earliest 27 manuscripts that actually have a page one, every single one of them have the author, and here's what they all say, one of two things. It says the gospel according to, and you know who is it? Always Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are no exceptions. Even in different languages, there are no exceptions, and they're coming from all around the Mediterranean world. No exceptions. They're all according to Matthew, or according to Mark, or according to Luke, or according to John. Some of them say the gospel according to in the same names. And so because some of them say the gospel, and some of them just say according to, Bart Ehrman wants to say that there are a multitude of different titles. I think, does he have an agenda or what? I don't know. So what I'm saying is this, you may have some reasons to disbelieve the resurrection of Christ, but the dating of the Gospels and the authorship of the Gospels should not be one of those things. Thanks for watching.